This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Some of the turning points of history just happen. Volcanoes erupt. Earthquakes, floods and fires destroy cities. But most of the turning points of history do not just happen.
This was their final tower.
They are the result of actions taken by people.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
They are the work of those who use power, ambition, belief to shape events. People are the authors of history.
It's the curious thing about history that we all understand the great currents matter. The institutions matter, geography matters, economics matters, what natural resources you have matters. But I do think there are moments in history when it really matters who's in power.
This is the story of the people who, holding or reaching for power, shaped our world. The titans of the 20th century. It had been a mere 20 years since the greatest war in history ended. And now the world seemed to be moving inexorably towards another catastrophe. Some believed that it was worth doing anything to avoid such a disaster.
There were a number of reasons why the British felt that it was necessary to try and avoid a war. The primary reason, of course, was they'd just come through a dreadful war. The combination of memories of the old war, fears of what a new war would look like, and a sense that maybe Germany had justifiable demands helped to lead into this attempt to appease Germany. And I think it was an honorable attempt. I think trying to avoid a war is actually a good thing.
The honorable attempt failed. In less than 2 years, Europe would be at war. In less than 3, the European continent would have been unimaginably transformed by the clash of titans. (1938) did not begin well for the liberal democracies. On January 30th, Francisco Franco established his first cabinet of ministers in Burgos.
Franco was an unlikely dictator because he lacked charisma. He wasn't particularly charismatic looking. He was a small, rather stout man with a fairly high-pitched voice.
There are aspects of Franco that are pure comedy. He has a notion of autarky, he wants Spain to be self-sufficient. He's a man who believed in alchemy, thought he could resolve Spain's economic problems by turning lead into gold.
On the 12th of March, when Negrin, Spain's Republican Prime Minister, arrived in Paris to ask for help in the Civil War, Hitler annexed Austria, which extinguished any possibility of French boldness. Negrin returned to Barcelona the day before unopposed Italian air raids killed 1,000 in that city. "This will send up our stocks in Germany," said Count Ciano. "They love total and ruthless war."
Germany and Italy were able to pour aid for the nationalist war effort via Franco. Whereas the sister democracies of Spain, Britain and France, refused even to sell them arms. So they had to go to the Soviet Union.
The British Empire would run far less risk from the victory of the Spanish government than from that of General Franco, Churchill said. But it was too late.
If you love history, then you'll love History Hit. Our extensive library of documentary features everything from the ancient origins of our earliest ancestors to the daring mission to sink the Bismarck. History Hit has hundreds of exclusive documentaries with unrivaled access to the world's best historians. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
Dolores Ibarra was an astounding orator. That's why she comes to the fore at a point at which the Communist Party need a figurehead, and she's absolutely the best figurehead you could have.
Communists, socialists, anarchists, republicans, La Pasionaria said. Men of different colors, different ideology, antagonistic religions, yet all profoundly loving liberty and justice, they came and offered themselves to us unconditionally. They gave us everything. We shall not forget you. Like Spain, full-scale war was the condition in China. On February 18th, Japanese planes had bombed Chongqing, the provincial capital to which Chiang Kai-shek had withdrawn his government. In June 1938, to disrupt the Japanese advance, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the opening of the dikes on the Yellow River, flooding low-lying lands. The resultant death toll is unknown.
I think that showed that he was a pretty ruthless operator. The Japanese had taken Shanghai, the major city in nationalist China, had then taken Nanjing, and then were moving up on Wuhan. So, you know, this was a pretty desperate time, but he was ready to take desperate measures.
On January 16th, Japanese Prime Minister Konoe announced that Japan no longer recognized the Chinese government. Negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek ended, and a disastrous war was the only option. At the end of his life, Konoe described the speech as an utter blunder. The age of blunders would make a serviceable label. In the Soviet Union between 1929 and 1938, 94% of the country's 26 million peasant holdings had been rolled into 250,000 collective farms.
The collectivization of agriculture has an enormous effect on the whole of Soviet society. At some stages of the height of collectivization, about 40 to 50,000 peasants are arriving in cities a week. All of these people then have to be housed in these cities. They have to be provided with social services. This has enormous social fallout.
On March 12th, units of the German 8th Army crossed the border unopposed, and Germany annexed Austria, the Anschluss. The Austrian Chancellor, Schuschnigg, said of meeting Hitler that he felt as though he had met a madman who thinks he is God.
Hitler, of course, was very clever at sounding very moderate. You know, we just want to protect our fellow Germans. There are all those Germans in Austria. Why shouldn't they join with us? What about national self-determination? They want to join with us. And if we get that, we're going to settle down.
Hitler made his triumphant entry into Vienna. As Führer and Chancellor, I report before history the entry of my homeland into the German Reich, he said.
Through the lubrication of propaganda, it was made to seem a triumphal entry and was disguised by showing acclamatory crowds which were genuine enough. But they probably only represented a minority of the Austrian people.
Hitler had succeeded in the Saar, the Rhineland, and now Austria. He turned to the borderland with Czechoslovakia, where at Versailles more than 3 million German speakers, who had not been given any say in their citizenship, had been incorporated into the new state.
Hitler presented himself and Germany as the protector of all ethnic Germans all over Europe. And the leader of the Sudeten German party did everything to undermine Czechoslovak control. So he provoked the Czechoslovak government to repression. So he created a situation of crisis.
Hitler asked, Why shouldn't these good Sudeten Germans be part of the Reich? This was the crisis that built to a notorious climax.
My policy has always been to try to ensure peace, and the Führer's ready acceptance encourages me to hope that my visit to him will not be without result.
As Neville Chamberlain flew to Berchtesgaden for his first meeting with Hitler, a bumpy, storm-tossed flight of 7 hours, the Prime Minister was 69. The Czech ambassador to Britain, Jan Masaryk, expressed himself fearful of Chamberlain's senile ambition. As soon as Hitler sees that old man, said Mussolini, he will know that he has won the battle.
Hitler always followed a strategy of asking for something until it looked like he was going to get it, and then upping the demands and asking for more. It's very likely that he actually didn't want to negotiate with Chamberlain over the Sudetenland in 1938. What he wanted was a war. A lot of senior army officers and diplomatic people and so on had no problem with a war just with Czechoslovakia, which they thought they could win. They very much assumed in 1938 that they would lose a war against Britain and France.
I've come back again, rather quicker than I expected.
But sending British troops into Central Europe was not an option. Neither was the expectation of military support from France.
At the time of appeasement, the Daladier government did not want war. And when appeasement was voted on in the French Parliament, it was only the Communist Party in 1938, plus one or two zany right-wing people, one of them a royalist, who voted against the Munich settlement.
An appeaser, Churchill said, is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last.
Churchill is the figurehead of the anti-appeasement point of view, but he was deeply unpopular. Churchill was unpopular amongst his own party. Everyone was very suspicious of him. There was no inbuilt inevitability about Churchill replacing Chamberlain. Let's not forget the best way to damn a political figure in this period was to call them a warmonger.
After Bad Godesberg, their second meeting, the Times asked whether the Nazis were intending to murder a nation because it is in the way, and Hitler issued an ultimatum demanding the Sudetenland.
Czechoslovakia as a state could have defended itself. The Czech armament industry was excellent. The Skoda factory produced excellent tanks and weapons. If it got military support, it would have held out for quite a long time, as long as it still held the Sudeten region, because here all the fortifications were.
On September 28th, with Hitler's ultimatum about to expire, Chamberlain sent a proposal to El Duce that he mediate negotiations. Hitler said, "My good friend Benito Mussolini has asked me to delay the marching orders of the German army, and I have agreed." Chamberlain agreed to go to Munich.
When he arrives in Germany, when he arrives in Munich on the third visit, he's completely treated to these great, great crowds of those who see him as the savior of peace. Oh, he's eclipsed the popularity of all the dictators, even within their own countries.
The mood in the United States was, above all, to stay out.
The only thing that Roosevelt does throughout the Munich crisis is sort of send a very, very short letter of encouragement to Chamberlain.
FDR's cable contained 2 words, good man.
Privately, however, Roosevelt was very skeptical. He made a comment to one of his advisors that if the mayor of Chicago made a deal with the gangsters to, stop crime, and 3 weeks later the crime spree broke out again, his political career would be finished.
Roosevelt also sent Hitler a message. The government of the United States, it said, has no political involvement in Europe.
Hitler needed to position himself really for his own public opinion so that it looked like he had done everything he could It was clear to everybody around him in the days and weeks and months right after Munich that he was terribly unhappy with the way the settlement had been concluded because he had really wanted a war and not an agreement.
Hitler explained the crisis to his followers. 10 million Germans found themselves outside the Reich's confines, Germans who desired to come back into their homeland. Bringing them into the Reich was, Hitler said, the last territorial demand I have to make in Europe. The Guardian newspaper declared that the pacificators of Munich returned home yesterday to receive greater gratitude than has ever been given to any returning conqueror.
We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire never to go to war with one another again.
On his return to Heston Aerodrome, Chamberlain said, "The settlement of the Czechoslovak problem is, in my view, only a prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace." There was one obvious difficulty.
There was one state which was not invited, which had tried in the 1930s to form a collective security system in Europe, which was meant to contain aggressive Germany and aggressive Italy. This was the Soviet Union. Stalin started to think that maybe the reason behind this appeasement policy is to direct Hitler against the Soviet Union.
On the 5th of October, Churchill rose to speak in the Commons. "Do not suppose that this is the end," he said. "This is only the beginning of the reckoning."
Churchill certainly regarded the Munich Agreement as a sellout of Czechoslovakia by Britain and France. He even went so far in Parliament as to say that Czechoslovakia could have done better negotiating by itself. He believed that only a threat of a declaration of war would have prevented the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia.
It may be that we sometimes overstate the importance of the Titan. One man, no matter how powerful, cannot after all control the weather, the conduct of each individual soldier, or the reliability of each machine. But sometimes it is a few men in a room. In Munich, it was a few men in a room. Paul Reynaud, the French finance minister, said in a radio broadcast on November 12th, "We are going blindfold towards an abyss." The sentiment was not restricted to Europe.
To command respect for the rights of ourselves, we must keep ourselves adequately strong in national defense.
The breakdown of international order in the 1930s was a deep, deep concern to Roosevelt. Unfortunately, because of the mood of Congress and the isolationist sentiment in the country, FDR was very limited in what he could do. He made a comment in early November to his Senate Foreign Relations Committee. If he'd had 5,000 planes and the ability to manufacture 10,000 in a short order of time, Hitler would have thought twice about the Munich Agreement.
Harold Ickes, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, said, "It looks as if all the courage has oozed out of the president. He has acted to me like a beaten man." When FDR signed a Fair Labor Standards Act into law, the last reform of the New Deal had been concluded, and Roosevelt knew it. "That's that," he is reported to have said.
Roosevelt is inevitably becoming more focused on the international crisis. The Spanish Civil War, the conflict that breaks out between Japan and China, and then, of course, the big year of 1938, that's inevitably again sort of sucking Roosevelt's interest into foreign affairs.
In 1939, Politburo member Anastas Mikoyan said of Stalin that he was an utterly changed person, absolutely suspicious, ruthless, and boundlessly self-confident, speaking often in the third person. I think, Mikoyan continued, he went balmy.
Because we have this vision of Stalin as a very powerful, paranoid figure, we can forget actually how insecure the Bolshevik Party state's grip on affairs were.
In the 1930s, the Soviet Union is a pariah state. It's internationally isolated, so the Soviet state to no small extent is legitimate in feeling itself threatened.
On the 6th anniversary of his assumption of power, January 30th, 1939, Hitler made a speech to the Reichstag, promising that if international Jewry should succeed in plunging the nation into a world war, the result will be the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe. So was he balmy?
Hitler was convinced that he was going to die young. He was a major hypochondriac, and in 1939 he turned 50, and he thought he was the only person who could lead Germany into the war for expansion that he thought Germany desperately needed.
The day after the speech, Roosevelt said of Hitler, "There isn't any use calling him a nut because he is a power and we have to recognize that." On March 3rd, Hitler announced the German forces would move to occupy Prague and eliminate the Czech state in 5 days.
That's the point where Hitler starts to annex things that are beyond what was agreed at the Paris Peace Conference. That's where you know that this man's shopping list just continues and you're on it.
It was after Munich. He said the French and the British, when it comes to it, they don't resist their worms. He didn't say that publicly, but it's recorded he said it. So Britain and France, he thought, wouldn't have the mettle to fight.
On March 15th, 1939, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement, grabbed all he wanted of the Czech lands, and Mussolini complained, "The Italians will laugh at me. Every time Hitler takes a country, he sends me a message."
Mussolini grudgingly has to accept that his best chances of success are with going along with this new force. He never gets over it.
Hardly anyone watched Hitler's entry into Prague. But thousands cheered his return to Berlin. The invasion of Czechoslovakia demolished the policy of appeasement. Churchill wrote that, "The government have now adopted the foreign policy which I have long been pressing, and consequently I am in very good relations with them." On March 31st, Neville Chamberlain rose in the House of Commons to pledge to Poland all support in Britain's power.
Our assurances to Poland are clear and precise. If an attempt were made to change the situation by force, that would inevitably start a general conflagration in which this country would be involved.
And I think even in the crisis of 1939 himself, okay, he gives an agreement to Poland, but I think all the way he's desperately trying to avoid war, and he's desperately hoping that Hitler's going to step back from the brink.
On April 3rd, a directive issued by Hitler instructed the armed forces to be ready for an attack on Poland any time after September 1st.
The trouble is, Poland was ripe. It had no natural defensive barriers. Its armed forces were in a state of great weakness. He was furious with the Poles because they refused to negotiate a realignment of territory, and he also needed to go through Poland to achieve the final consummation, which was the attack on Russia.
On the 13th, Anglo-French guarantees were made to Greece and Romania, but the debate in the Commons did not please Chamberlain. "I had hoped for a better speech from Winston," he wrote, "but there was an acid undertone and I felt depressed when he sat down." To bolster his sliding self-esteem, Mussolini had launched an invasion of Albania on Good Friday, April 7th.
Italy always invades Albania on a religious day. They'd invaded it on Christmas Day, 1914. They come back on Good Friday, 1939.
and establish a curious regime.
Mussolini said that his troops were going to Albania to restore order and justice. But the clumsiness of the operation exposed Italian military might as being, in the words of Foreign Minister Ciano, a tragic bluff.
By 1939, Mussolini was realizing that he was in a pickle. He had committed to a military alliance with Germany, and yet his military was exhausted from Ethiopia, from Spain, from Albania, and they were in no shape to start a war.
On May 19th, a grand victory parade in Madrid had trooped up
for Stalin to get help to the Republic.
Roosevelt acknowledged that arms should have been supplied to the Republican government to fight for her life and, he added prophetically, for the lives of some of the rest of us, as events will like prove. On July 28th, Neville Chamberlain wrote to his sister, "Hitler has concluded that we mean business and that the time is not ripe for the major war. Therein, he is fulfilling my expectations."
I think people living in times of tension still don't think there's really going to be a war. They still think that somehow a deal will be reached. And there were lots of British people who went to Germany in the summer of 1939 to go walking, for example, in the Black Forest, thinking things will probably be okay.
On August 20th, 1939, Hitler sent a telegram to Stalin proposing a treaty. In reply, he received an invitation for Foreign Minister Ribbentrop to visit Moscow. "Marvelous," Hitler said. "I have the world in my pocket."
With the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he was trying to deceive the Russians that they could do a joint business. The aim was to lull the victim into a false sense of security.
In the first instance, there seems to be real advantage for Stalin and the Soviet state. The pact itself would encourage Hitler to make his move against Poland, therefore precipitating a long, grinding war with Britain and France that will weaken Germany.
At the end of August, the Soviet-German non-aggression pact was signed. When Stalin invited his foreign minister to explain Soviet objectives to von Ribbentrop, Molotov said, No, Joseph Vissarionovich. I'm sure that you'll do a better job than I."
There doesn't seem to be a real downside for Stalin in signing the pact. This buys the Soviet Union time to allow the Red Army to rebuild itself. The third five-year plan is manufacturing now armaments. It allows the Soviet Union to have a sphere of influence over Finland, to take over the Baltic states, to get eastern Poland and parts of eastern Romania. This gives Stalin control, together with Hitler, of Eastern Europe.
Stalin's main concern was public reaction to a pact. After all, as he reminded his German visitor, for many years now, we've been pouring buckets of shit over each other's heads. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's photographer, accompanied Ribbentrop, and Hitler was most anxious to see his photographs and relieved to observe that Stalin had separate and Aryan earlobes, rather than ingrown and Jewish ones.
He saw Stalin as the ultimate dull pedestrian bureaucrat, so very different from Adolf Hitler, the man who was the vivid actor, dramaturge, master of rhetoric.
These were the titans making history. In accordance with Article 2 of the Secret Additional Protocol of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, Soviet troops entered Poland on September 17th, 2 weeks behind Germany's invasion. German troops had occupied the Rhineland, forced the incorporation of Austria into the Reich and marched into Czechoslovakia. But it was not until the invasion of Poland that they fired their first shot in order, as Hitler said, to expand our living space in the East and make food supplies secure. Everything I have worked for, everything I have hoped for, everything that I have believed in during my public life has crashed in ruins, said Neville Chamberlain in the House of Commons on September 3rd, 1939. In October, de Gaulle wrote, "In my opinion, the enemy will not attack for a long while. Then, when he judges we are weary with waiting, he will launch an offensive." He did. In January 1940, Communist leader Zhou Enlai sent a report to Moscow. It stated that 1 million Chinese soldiers had been killed up to August of 1939, the month before the rest of the world says the war began. He admitted that only 3% of these casualties were from Red Army units.
The Communist Party under Mao had a different priority. His priority was to expand the Communist Party and the Chinese Red Army in order to prepare for the end of the war.
In his report, Zhou also said that Chiang Kai-shek was carrying out a war of liberation unprecedented in Chinese history, and that officers, regardless of class origin, were demonstrating determination, courage, and selflessness.
Stalin did realize that Chiang Kai-shek was the only Chinese leader who could put up a stiff resistance.
This history, which has subsequently been rewritten, is of a real war. The label given to events in Europe by an American senator was phony war. The phoniness ended with the Allied action in Norway, which was a disaster. In the Commons, Clement Attlee led the opposition's attack on May 7th. Of Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Norway, Clement Attlee said, "Everywhere the story is too late." The failure of operations in Norway hastened the fall of Neville Chamberlain, who might have considered a negotiated peace, which his successor would not. On the 5th of March, Stalin approved the murder of Polish officers and possible leaders who may contest Soviet control. At 5 forest sites, including Katyn, 21,892 victims were shot. Further 60,000 with their families were deported to Kazakhstan. The Great German Offensive had begun on the 10th of May.
As a country, socially, I think France, again, is a very divided society and is subjected to the invasion of 1940 and collapses in 6 weeks.
I have the impression that the surprise has been overcome and we are re-establishing ourselves, de Gaulle wrote on May 24th, the day after his promotion to Brigadier General, making him the youngest general in the French army. But, he went on, we have lost a lot of feathers and will lose many more.
De Gaulle's views of everybody are rarely kind, I think. De Gaulle is a highly clever, highly literate, highly sophisticated man. De Gaulle has an elevated sense of his own destiny.
On the day that de Gaulle made his prediction, May 24th, Group von Kleist, comprising 3 panzer divisions, was ordered to halt. It stopped less than 25 kilometers from Dunkirk. Here was the moment for which Churchill was made. To stare down defeat and the defeatists, and to tell the House of Commons on June 4th,
"We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight in the air, we shall never surrender."
Churchill was not a natural speechmaker. He, in fact, had an impediment. He had a lisp. But what Churchill did have was a great ability to write.
Churchill's speeches were extraordinary, really. He took, it was said by his private secretary, an hour to write 1 minute of his speeches.
2 weeks after, "We shall never surrender." His speech told his countrymen that this was their finest hour, and on August 20th he paid eloquent tribute to the few.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Picture Post actually did a study at the time where they went to various pubs and so forth to see if people were listening. They found they were not very responsive. The early speeches didn't have the impact we think they have.
Only one letter is known to have gone from his loving, devoted and watchful Clemmy to Winston in the whole of 1940. In it she told him that people were complaining about his conduct. With his terrific power, she said, he must combine urbanity, kindness, and if possible, Olympic calm. It could be that, at least from the British point of view, that is one of the war's more important documents. On June 10th, the French government removed itself from Paris and Mussolini declared war.
World War II broke out in 1939. Mussolini was completely unprepared. He declared a state of non-belligerence, and this was a shameless effort to buy time. When he chose to come in the war, it's because he thought it would be quick and easy because Hitler was having success in France.
On June 14th, General Bogislav von Studnitz led the 87th Infantry Division through the almost deserted streets of Paris. On June the 18th, the anniversary of Waterloo, 86-year-old Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun, who had been recalled from his post as ambassador to Spain, announced that he had taken over as head of state and was seeking an armistice.
For thousands, if not millions of French people, Pétain was the leader who saved their lives in 1940. So for a long time, 1940 until 1942, most people were much more in favor of Pétain than they were of de Gaulle.
And on June the 18th, de Gaulle broadcast from London.
Nous croyons que l'honneur des Français consiste à continuer la guerre aux côtés de leurs alliés, et nous sommes résolus à le faire.
This war has not been settled by the Battle of France. This is a world war, he said.
He's seen by the British as a Napoleonic figure, but usually as one of the minor officers in Napoleon's entourage. British certainly hope that someone more major than de Gaulle will come over from France, who they will be able to use as their tool against Vichy France.
De Gaulle, I think, played a brilliant hand as the leader of the Free French, but he declared that he was going to lead the resistance from London. As Churchill said at one point, look at that man, he has no troops, he's been condemned to death by the Vichy government, and yet he acts as though he was the head of an enormous army.
He's incredibly tactless, he's incredibly rude, he's incredibly odd, he's incredibly arrogant. I think to some extent he needs to be all those things precisely because he's weak. He knows he's playing a game of bluff.
And on June the 18th, Churchill told the House of Commons, "The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." On July 7th, Gandhi offered Satyagraha as a way forward for the British. "You will invite Herr Hitler and Signor Mussolini to take possession of your beautiful island with your many beautiful buildings," he suggested.
Hitler, as a person, flummoxes Gandhi. He disrupts Gandhi's worldview in a way that virtually no one else had. Gandhi fundamentally believed in the goodness of all people, and that if you touched the right thing, they could be converted. But ultimately, he comes to the conclusion that Hitler cannot be reached and that he must be stopped.
The deposed Kaiser, from exile in the Netherlands, telegrammed Hitler, "My Führer," he wrote, "I congratulate you and hope that under your marvelous leadership the German monarchy will be restored completely." Hitler turned to his valet. "What an idiot," he said.
We can't underestimate the significance of the fall of France. Suddenly, Roosevelt is faced with the possibility that, the only thing standing between us and the Nazis is the Royal Navy. It's at this point that you see the destroyers for bases deal of September of 1940, where the United States gave the British 50 old destroyers, which, by the way, Roosevelt crammed with additional weapons without telling anyone. On August 14th, Hitler explained to the 12 generals he had raised to the rank of Field Marshal that Germany could not benefit from defeating Britain. The beneficiaries of that, Hitler said, would be Japan in Asia, Russia in India, Italy in the Mediterranean, and the United States in world trade. That, Hitler said, is why peace is possible with Britain. But it was not. On July 18th, General Hideki Tojo, who would be wartime prime minister, had been appointed Japan's Minister for War. And on September 27th, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact.
日中戦争がなかなか終わらないわけですね。どうしてなのかっていうと、これは中国をイギリスが支援している。だからなかなか日本がいくら戦っても日中戦争が終わらない。
そこで当時ヨーロッパでイギリスと敵対していたドイツやイタリアと同盟を結ぶことによってイギリスなどを威圧しようと考えました。
結局日中戦争解決のために三国同盟を結んでいくというこういう流れになります。
On October 23rd, Hitler went to meet Franco.
Franco arrives on this decrepit old train, whereas the Nazis arrive on this beautiful modern job. And you can actually see from the newsreel, Franco's eyes are glistening. He's almost in tears at the thrill of meeting his great hero.
It was not a successful coming together of two dictators. Franco disappointed any expectation Hitler had that Spain would involve itself in the war. He also disappointed Hitler as a person.
Hitler made it pretty clear to Mussolini a little later on that he would prefer to have, in his words, 3 or 4 teeth taken out rather than meet that man again.
The trial of meeting Franco over, Hitler issued Directive 21 on December 18th. The German armed forces, it said, must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a rapid campaign. 23-year-old John F. Kennedy's book, Why England Slept, was published in 1940. His father, Joseph Kennedy, Roosevelt's ambassador to Britain, advocated a negotiated peace with Hitler. Roosevelt, elected for a third term in November on a promise that no Americans would be sent to foreign wars, gave his answer.